This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, a programme brought to you by the Southern Heritage Trust. I'm Dougal Stevenson. Like many of you, we're on a holiday at this time of year. So we thought you might like to hear some of the programmes we think are some of our best for 2025. In this programme, we bring you stories about two sons of the Dunedin suburb of Ravensbourne who may have been treated unjustly. One was sent home from an All Black tour, and the other was denied the Victoria Cross Medal. And we hear from Alison Breeze about the Willowbank heritage area. We'll end with a piece from Gregor Campbell about a cycle accident. This is a story about the All Black who never came home. Just over 50 years ago, Dunedin rugby player Keith Murdoch became the first and the last All Black to be banned from a tour for misbehaviour. There are varying opinions about the justice or injustice of the punishment. Many rugby followers think he was simply a victim of circumstance. This report from Bill Southworth.
Keith Murdoch was a very strong front-row forward of impressive physical build. He was 6 foot tall, weighed 110 kilos, and his 1.2 metre or 48-inch barrel chest was so large that the All Black tailor had to sew panels of extra material into his jackets and shirts. When he was selected for the 1972 tour of the UK, Ireland and France, his Ravensbourne family and his Zingaree Richmond club mates were over the moon. But all that came crashing down after a post-match Saturday night at the Angel Hotel in Cardiff. The day had begun well for Murdoch. He scored the winning trial in his team's 19-16 win over Wales at Cardiff Arms Park. They'd been celebrating that night at their hotel when apparently Murdoch, who had been drinking, headed back to the kitchen, either to get more liquor or some food. Accounts varied as to what happened next. But what is certain is that Murdoch punched a security guard named Peter Grant, who ended up on the floor with a black eye. Other team members hustled Murdoch away, and he eventually went to bed. What had occurred between the two men prior to the punch is subject to debate, but it has been asserted that the Welsh security guard deliberately offended and insulted the All Black. Legendary player Sir Brian Williams later wrote,
"Welshman had been niggling Murdoch all night. When Grant deliberately bumped into him and said, 'So you're the one who thinks he's so bloody tough,' Keith reacted like a mad bull, but was obviously needled into it."
After the punching incident, the next morning there was a meeting between the team's manager, Ernie Todd, the All Black captain, Ian Kirkpatrick, and the vice-captain, Sid Going. There was agreement that Murdoch would not be sent home. Kirkpatrick later recalled being emphatic, "No way he's going home. We'll settle this in-house." Later on Sunday morning, the team's manager, Ernie Todd, remonstrated with Murdoch, and the team then boarded their bus and headed for Birmingham, where they were scheduled to play Midland counties. Once there, Murdoch was named in the team for that game. The seasoned sports journalist Ron Polensky, in his book, Murdoch, the All Black Who Never Returned, gave this assessment of Murdoch's character.
He was regarded with something approaching awe by his teammates because of his strength, and with affection and fondness for his gentle, caring manner and rough-hewn manner. His dark side came when he had too much to drink, as it does for a lot of people. By various accounts, it wasn't that he became violent because of booze, he became violent because he was goaded, and the booze clouded his control.
On Monday morning, there was a shock announcement. Murdoch was being sent home. What had happened is an interesting story in itself. Manager Ernie Todd insisted the decision had been his alone. It was not. He had been forced into it. What really transpired, and what was confirmed some years later, was that the UK rugby officials were shocked when Murdoch was chosen to play in the next game, while he was meant to be given appropriate disciplinary action. John Tallant, chairman of the Four Home Unions Tours Committee, told Jack Sullivan, chairman of the New Zealand Rugby Football Union, that if Murdoch was not sent home, then the tour would be in jeopardy. If Murdoch was not sent home, they would want Ernie Todd replaced. Ian Kirkpatrick said it was one of the saddest events of his entire life. On the day of the incident, he said he made it absolutely clear that he wanted Murdoch to remain on the tour. Looking back on the way it was handled, Kirkpatrick has regrets.
It came as a real shock when the following day manager Ernie Todd announced that Keith was being sent home. I knew Ernie had been under pressure to dismiss Keith from the tour. What I didn't know until years later how much pressure the 4 home unions had exerted on our manager. In reality, it took a few days before the enormity of the situation really sunk in. But one thing's for sure. The more I thought about it as the tour unfolded, the more I believed we should have put our foot down and issued an ultimatum. If Keith goes home, we all go home. It's a thought that has never left me.
Murdoch was quickly taken to Heathrow Airport and put on a plane back to New Zealand. He never arrived. At Singapore, he switched to a flight to Australia and then disappeared into the outback of that vast continent. It's now known he flattered for a while in Perth and then worked in the minerals-rich Pilbara area in the northwest, 1,200 kilometres north of Perth. There he was tracked down 2 years later by New Zealand Herald veteran sports reporter Terry McLean, who was told in no uncertain terms to get back on the bus. In 1990, he was located by a New Zealand television crew in North Queensland town of Tully, working on a banana plantation. When the crew tried to film him, he ran off. About 1995, Ian Kirkpatrick went to Tully to find him, but was told that after the television crew incident, Murdoch had been spooked and taken off into parts unknown. He made fleeting visits to New Zealand, and for a period he worked at Turangi on the Tongariro power scheme. During a New Zealand visit to a former teammate in Timaru, he saved the life of the man's 3-year-old son, who had been found lying face down in their swimming pool. He gave mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and when, after a couple of minutes, that didn't seem to work, he switched to delivering CPR, pushing the small boy's chest with his great hands. This brought the child back to consciousness. His mother was adamant that Keith had saved the boy's life. When a reporter and photographer from the Timaru Herald called, he disappeared again. Murdoch spent 10 years at Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. The nearest big town is Alice Springs, about 500 kilometres to the south. To the north, Darwin is nearly 1,000 kilometres away. Tennant Creek has a population of 3,800 and was surrounded by vast cattle stations. There, Murdoch worked for a while. He never talked about his past and was something of a recluse. Even his closest mate, Bob Fender, didn't know he'd been an All Black. One night when they were watching the All Blacks play in the World Cup final on TV, Murdoch muttered, "I used to play rugby." But beyond that, he did not elaborate. As one local said,
"There's an unspoken rule here. You never ask anyone where they're from or what they're doing here, because you know everyone is running away from something. This is like a refuge for runaways. People always find their peace here because they aren't judged. They're taken on their merit. And I guess that's the kind of peace Keith found here."
In 2001, that peace was shattered. The body of an Aboriginal man called Christopher Limerick was found down an abandoned mine shaft near Tennant Creek. He was a notorious drunk and petty thief, and Murdoch had caught him in his house and belted him before throwing him out. Later, others had seen Limerick heading in the direction of the mine shaft. At the coroner's inquest, Murdoch was questioned, but he was never suspected of murdering the man. Suspicion actually fell on another resident of Tennant Creek, but that man was never charged. Murdoch spent his last years living in the Western Australian town of Carnarvon, population 4,800, where he died of cancer in 2018 at the age of 74. In a special gesture, he was posthumously awarded his rugby cap for the ill-fated Welsh Test. Each time the All Blacks play in Cardiff, they make sure they attend a special ceremony. They have a beer for Keith at the Angel Hotel. For much of this material, I'm grateful to Ron Polensky and his book, Murdoch, the All Black Who Never Returned. This is Bill Southworth reporting for Heritage Matters.
In the heat of battle, acts of heroism can be overlooked. This may have been the case for Colin Boswell, who performed an act of great valour as the Kiwis were retreating from the German onslaught on mainland Greece in World War II. This report from Gregor Campbell.
Colin Boswell from Ravensbourne was a builder when he joined the New Zealand Army in 1940, so it was logical that he should be posted to the engineers. He was with them during the 1941 campaign in Greece, and possibly died performing a feat which would have won him the Victoria Cross. The scene was the Corinth Canal. The bridge over the canal was prepared to be blown up, both to deny it to the invading German army and hopefully to drop into and block the canal. But until that time, it was kept intact for the retreating Allied forces. The engineers guarding the bridge were not prepared, however, for what happened on the morning of April 26, when German aircraft attacked them. It was the precursor to an attack by airborne forces in gliders and under parachutes. Lieutenant Douglas Kelsall described in the engineers' official history what happened next. It was not given to me to know that a few hours earlier, a very senior officer had stopped to have a word with the sappers, and that he had firmly impressed on them that there was another convoy yet to pass through. He added that under no conditions was the bridge to be destroyed for at least 24 hours, which put the NCO in charge of the party in rather a spot when the band began to play in the morning. Disobey a written order from a subaltern or a verbal order from a staff officer with red braid all round his hat, he did the obvious thing. Left the bridge cold, jumped a truck, came out through a hail of lead. Happily ignorant of this development, I watched the fourth or fifth row of parachutes laid neatly across what had been our camp. Not a sign of the lads, and another trio of Yonkers 52s hove in sight. I deemed it high time to head for the horizon. The bridge was thus seized intact, no mean prize to a commander who wanted to push south after the elusive Anzacs, and no mean embarrassment to a commander who had planned to move the rest of his division into the Peloponnese and embark from beaches there. The German elation terminated when, with a roar followed by an immense smoke cloud, the structure collapsed into the canal. A massive conflicting evidence has been collected regarding the cause of the explosion that wrecked the Corinth Bridge, but there is at least one witness who is quite certain that 2 New Zealand sappers lost their lives in the attempt. Here is the testimony of Gunner H.E. Smith, who had been wounded at Tempe, missed embarkation at Megara, and was being taken by truck to another beach. We were hardly across the bridge, travelling south, when the blitz started. We jumped the transport and I made for a clump of rocks. I was still hugging a Bren and some ammo picked up the night before. It was here that I first met the 2 engineers. One remarked that if Jerry hit the bridge, she'd go sky high, as it was loaded to the gills with TNT. The longer the raid continued, the more they remarked on it not getting hit. They couldn't understand it. I looked up and saw the parachutists dropping. We jumped up, and being firmly convinced that the parachutists wouldn't take prisoners, we decided to sell out as dear as possible. I made for a mound, followed by the 2 sappers, and it was then we saw the bridge still intact. One sapper said to the other, "They're after that bridge, boss." It was either boss or bossy. It was here that the idea came to blow the bridge. There was a hurried huddle to see whether the 3 of us went, or 1 or 2. It was decided on 2, and I'd cover with the Brens, as the Huns were well on the ground and making things hot. From where I was, I could give complete cover, as the bridge was plain ahead. The next second, the boys were gone, and so long as I could, I kept them in my sight. But believe me, trying to keep up with the Huns didn't leave much time. Quite a fair bunch of Huns were coming in from the northern end, and soon apparently guessed what was going on and endeavoured to stop them. Just short of the bridge, one of the boys fell. The other made the bridge for shore as he came right in sight. For a moment I thought he'd been hit, as he seemed to fall, but the next I saw he was coming back. He looked to have cleared the bridge when it seemed to heave, and the next moment she was sky high. Considering the sapper's position, it doesn't surprise me to hear there's no trace of his or the other sapper's body, as by the blast on the rock that came over, they must have been blown to pieces. It's not known what Boswell or his mate did on the Corinth Canal Bridge that day. It was certainly an act of great courage to attempt to blow the bridge, whether they did or not, and they certainly paid the price. A British Army engineer officer was decorated for firing the charge. He'd been shooting at it with a rifle in hopes of setting it off. The German forces were certainly successful in denying the bridge to the retreating Allied forces, but it cost them in the blocking of the canal. Part of their blitzkrieg timetable was to hold the bridge intact so that a fuel tanker could pass through the canal and be waiting at a Greek port to refuel tanks and transport when they arrived. The canal was blocked for 3 weeks, and the tanker had to take the long way round. Colin Boswell's remains were never found. He was posted as missing, and eventually, with no news of him through the Red Cross, was presumed dead. And I am, as a fellow Ravensbournian, in awe of Colin Boswell and his mates. For Heritage Matters, Gregor Campbell.
Dunedin is blessed with areas of heritage value, and Alison Breeze from Heritage New Zealand has been looking at one such in the southern end of George Street, which would not have looked out of place in a 19th century English mill town.
Today I'll be featuring listed buildings within the Willowbank heritage area. Think Coronation Street-style terraced houses and cute cottages and villas. The Willowbank Residential Heritage Precinct is located at the northern end of George Street and encompasses part of Queen Street and Duke Street in the area adjoining Woodhall Gardens and the Water of Leith. The area is strongly defined not only by the large number of original homes and their quality and consistency, but also the unique setting of the Woodhall Gardens, the Leith, and the mature trees and gardens. The most common architectural style in the area is the double bay villa. There are large numbers of this archetypal style of building in blocks throughout Willowbank. Underscoring the area's importance of a microcosm of Dunedin's early society and economy, there are also a large number of working-class homes in the area, including terraces and cottages, often built to service nearby industries, side by side with larger mansion homes on much larger sites. By the 1870s, Pākehā settlement at this end of George Street saw breweries and flour mills established with the access to the freshwater source of the Leith. George Duncan owned a majority of these sections, originally with a flour mill from 1858 to 1873, when he sold all his property. Well Park Brewery was also established by George Duncan in 1862, and later it was operated by James Wilson until 1894. Victoria Terrace is located in the Willowbank Heritage Precinct, and the 5 houses that make up the terrace were built in 1897 by builder and property developer William King. The terrace complex has historic, architectural and aesthetic significance as a notable example of vernacular brick terrace-style residential dwellings, which were popular in the Victorian colonial era and is very important to the streetscape. King was selling land and new brick buildings in the 1890s, and he operated initially from the corner of Duke and George Street. He first entered into partnership with Richard Pope and George Elbury. After their deaths, King continued operating on a large scale and buying and subdividing blocks of land and building on some, particularly from the years 1894 to 1898. King applied for a permit to build a terrace of 5 brick houses with arched porches and recessed front doors. The distinctive facade of tuck-pointed red brick, highlighted with openings painted white to imitate coinwork, is covered by an iron roof. Despite considerable internal modernising, which has been carried out over the years, the general Victorian character remains. The similarities of this terrace block are very apparent to nearby cottages of 1008 and 1014 George Street. Between 1878 and 1895, this portion containing these cottages was purchased by William King in 1895. That same year, he further subdivided the property and constructed the 2 cottages at 1008 and 1014 George Street. The similarities of the 2 cottages are instantly apparent. They're basically twins. From 1897, the valuation roll shows the building at 1014 George Street was owned by William's wife, Jane King, and was rented out until her death in 1910. Throughout the 20th century, the overall layout of both cottages have had very little modification, and both cottages remain today as family homes. 4 Willowbank is the final house featured today and was built in 1915 by builders Brown and Mitchell. Neighbouring sections to 4 Willowbank house the flour mills and the brewery. Alan Stevens, a miller, purchased the sections in 1892 and ran the Water of Leith flour mill here under the company name of Stevens & Co. After his death in 1914, his widow, Lucy, built 4 Willowbank right next to the flour mill. This house is a notable example of a transitional villa built during a period of transition in New Zealand from villa to bungalow. As the villa style reached its peak of popularity, the design changed towards less ostentation and greater utility. The bungalows were heavily influenced by the California-style bungalow and were popular as cheaper builds and for comfort and convenience, and many could be ordered from a catalogue. St Kilda and Musselburgh have a lot of these style of houses. Constructed of plastered brick, 4 Willowbank has a curved veranda built as part of the main roof, typical of a transition villa, with plaster and brick veranda pillars. Unlike the more common steel roof of many bungalows, 4 Willowbank has a slate roof. It has many arts and crafts interior elements alongside Victorian architectural details. It has double hung windows and features fan lights, a special feature of New Zealand bungalow architecture, which have an Art Nouveau tulip motif repeated in the glass at the front door and the entranceway. It has partially bevelled skirtings and architraves with timbers far plainer than those of a villa. However, the arched entrance to the hallway from the foyer has ornate moulding and decorative details more akin to a Victorian villa. In the original plan, a maid's room is noted, which is also more typical of a villa. Lucy Stevens sold the house within a few years after building it, and the house went through a string of owners. This house has had little work done to it, and today it remains largely as it was originally designed. Willowbank Quarter is an especially attractive streetscape, and see if you can see any other similar builds to these ones mentioned in the area. This story was brought to you by Alison Breeze, reporting for Heritage Matters.
Cycle accidents are nothing new. Long before there were cycle lanes in Dunedin, the main road north had its challenges. Gregor Campbell has been looking at a cycle accident where a rider had a remarkable recovery.
There was once a place on the highway north out of Dunedin known as Hangman's Gully. It was a hairpin bend which needed care to navigate. Looking for possible stories from it, I found that of Arthur Steers, who, in 1912, was cycling down the hill and left the road at the gully. He dropped down a cliff and was found with a fractured skull. Trepanning was required. So much for Arthur Steers, I thought, expecting to find a death notice not long after the accident. But no, he survived and learned the profession of a ship's engineer. He was a second engineer in 1917 when his ship was captured and sunk by the Wolf, a German raider and mine layer operating in Pacific waters. The second officer of another captured ship, the Wairuna, described what Steers and his first engineer did when the Wolf was stopped off the Kermadec Islands. Two of our comrades, the chief officer, Mr. Cleland, and the second engineer, Mr. Steers, of the SS Turritella, escaped one night to a little island and were never recaptured. It was a very plucky venture, for we were 2 miles from the shore and there were quite a number of sharks about, some of which we had caught only the day before. They escaped just before we were sent below. They had fishing lines wound around them, a bottle each full of matches, fish hooks made out of nails, a knife and one of the life belts which they inflated when they got into the water. They got over the poop before dark and intended waiting in the water close to the rudder until darkness and then beat off for the island. They were going to keep together as long as possible so that they could make a combined defence if attacked by sharks. If one man failed, the other was to go on. We never saw them again, and the few of us who knew felt their absence very much, for they were fine fellows and game enough for anything. The Huns did not miss them until a long while afterwards. They did not know about it when they sent a lifeboat off with a squad to have a look at a hut there. They could not beach the boat, and one man had swum through the shore with a line and pulled in a raft. They brought back 4 sacks full of oranges, pineapples and bananas. With fruit and fish to live on, our comrades, if they got ashore safely, must be living the life of Robinson Crusoe, for the island was apparently uninhabited. Eventually, all hands were mustered, and then the Huns found out that the 2 were gone. Little Willie went white with rage, or it may have been fear of having to face his commander. "You answer me," he shouted to us. "These men escape. Where? What time? You understand? Yes. Stop as you are, stand." And then he went to try and explain to his terrible captain, nicknamed Almighty Joe. He returned in an hour to say that we should no longer be treated as gentlemen, that we would be mustered 4 times daily, allowed on deck only an hour a day for 28 days, and to buy no more than 1 bottle of beer a month. The most serious punishment was the confinement in the hold of the ship 23 hours out of the 24, together with the prisoners from the other British ships that had been captured. Altogether, there were between 200 and 300 of us. Towards the end of the war, Steers and Cleland were eulogised for their attempt to escape and alert Allied forces to the threat of the Wolf and its mines. When Second Engineer Arthur Steers and First Officer Cleland had been aided by their fellow prisoners on board the German raider Wolf to pass down the vessel's side to enable them to hide under the counter till darkness set in and they could start their perilous swim to shore, they completely passed out of the ken of their fellow men. How the two gallant seamen spent the tedious hours waiting for the time when they could slip into the water will apparently never be known. It was early in June 1917 that the escape took place, but it is only now that it is definitely known that the search of Sunday Island and other islands in the Kermadec group by a government steamer proved resultless. No trace that the men had even landed could be found. As a matter of fact, it was not till many months after that it was known that the Wolf had been at the Kermadecs and had met and sunk the Wairuna. Both the officers were on the Taratella, an oil cargo boat which was acting as a supply ship for the British Navy, and which had been captured by the Wolf some time before the Wairuna fell into the raiders' clutches in early June 1917, when the Union Steamship Company's vessel was steaming past the Kermadecs. Mr. Steers was the second son of Mr. and Mrs. Steers of Antrim Street, North East Valley. Another son is fighting in France. The former was born at Green Island 29 years ago, was educated at the Leith Valley School, served 3 years at Messrs. A&T Burt's, and commenced his trade at Messrs. Gardner's, Port Chalmers. He then went home and quickly gained distinction by obtaining his extra chief engineer's certificate. Mr. Cleland was the only support of his widowed mother, who lives at Limerick, Ireland. Both men willingly gave their lives in a gallant venture. They knew the perils which beset them. They must have become very cold before the time of their plunge into the ocean arrived. It was said that the place was infested with sharks, and yet their courage never faltered. It was not so much with the object of gaining their personal liberty that they decided on their gallant enterprise. Their first intention was to endeavour to send a warning, if possible, that a raider was at large, that she had laid many mines, and, in fact, to serve their country. The words in the last diary of Captain Scott, the polar explorer, when referring to his comrade Captain Oates' sacrifice, would well apply to these two mariners. Thus died two gallant gentlemen. And I'm the occasionally gallant Gregor Campbell for Heritage Matters.
This show will be replayed on Thursday the 19th of February at 1 p.m. and Sunday the 8th and the 22nd of February at 7 p.m.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.